My name is Ray, and I'm 58 years old. The eldest son, a title I wore for most of my life, though I never really felt like it meant much. My father was a man of few words. He didn't say much, but you knew exactly what he wanted. The world as he saw it didn't require endless praise or acknowledgement. It required effort. It required silence, patience, and strength. Those were the things he valued most. I was always the one to help him. Whether it was working on the land, fixing the car, or building the house, I was the one there beside him. And yet, I was never the one who was given anything. There was no expectation of reward. We didn't do things for the sake of praise. The house we built together, the one that stood tall and proud for 40 years, was nothing more than a reflection of those values: hard work, determination, and silence. I still remember the days when we started laying the foundation. I was young, eager, and perhaps a bit naive about what it would take to build something that could withstand time. I worked in the dirt and under the sun, side by side with him, never asking questions, just following the rhythm of the work. That house, every nail, every piece of wood, was a testament to his vision and my willingness to be a part of it. My brother Dan was 10 years younger. He was always the one who needed more attention, more help. I didn't mind. I could see how my father favored him, how he doted on him in ways I never received. But I never resented it. In my mind, my father's love was implicit, unspoken but strong. He didn't need to show it in grand gestures. I understood him in a way that Dan never did. I had grown up in his shadow, learning to be independent and resilient because that's what my father valued. The years went by, and the house was built, but life didn't slow down. I worked hard. My father never once said, "You've done enough." There was no praise, no recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of getting the job done. I learned to live with that silence. It was comfortable, familiar. When my father got sick, I noticed how everything started to change. He became quieter than usual, and his movements were slower. Still, he didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. I was the one who noticed, the one who stepped in without question. Dan, on the other hand, kept his distance. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation. He didn't know how to step into the role that had always been mine. I never said anything. I just did what I had always done, took care of things. And then, one day, my father passed away. I wasn't prepared for it, though I had known it was coming. The doctors had said he didn't have long, but there's something about knowing and truly understanding that makes a difference. I wasn't ready for the finality of it. There's no preparation for the moment when you realize someone who had always been there is gone for good. But I didn't have time to dwell on that. I had to take care of the funeral arrangements, handle the family business, deal with the things that needed to be done. The funeral was small, quiet. My father didn't have many friends. He didn't need them. He had built his life on his own terms. There were a few people who came, some distant relatives, some neighbors who had known him over the years. But it was all business. It wasn't until after everyone had left that I found the letter. It was waiting for me on the kitchen table, a plain envelope with my name on it. I knew immediately what it was: the will. My father had always been a man of few words, and this letter was no exception. It wasn't long, but it was direct. "Ray," it began, "you are strong. You can handle it." That was all. Those simple words. I don't know why, but I felt something break inside me when I read them. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something deeper, something quieter, a sense of finality, a realization that my father had always known what I was capable of, but he had never once told me directly. All those years, all that work. It wasn't about recognition. It was about surviving. I put the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't want to cry, didn't want to show weakness. I hadn't been taught to do that. I had been taught to endure. So I just folded the letter carefully, set it aside, and prepared myself for what came next. I looked around the house. Our house, the one I had helped build. It felt empty now, hollow, but it was still mine in a way. At least it was supposed to be. Dan was sitting in the living room when I returned, his eyes red from crying, his voice wavering as he tried to speak. But I didn't want to hear it. He was the youngest, the favorite. He would always have more. He had been given more. That's just how it was. I'll take care of everything, I said to him, my voice steady, controlled. He nodded, but I saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't understand. He never would. I didn't ask for much. I never had. But I always thought that when the time came, my father would leave me something. Something to show that all those years of work had meant something. But no, he had left it all to Dan. Everything. The house, the car, the land. It all went to him. I had always been the one who worked, the one who shouldered the burden. But now it seemed I was the one who had been forgotten. And yet, in his final words to me, my father had said I was strong, that I could handle it. Maybe that was the greatest gift he had given me, the ability to stand silent in the face of injustice, to endure, and to move forward. The reading of the will was brief, sterile, and to the point. My brother Dan sat across from me in the lawyer's office, his eyes darting nervously between the paper in front of him and the rest of the family. I could see the weight of it all on him, the unease creeping in as he scanned the will. But then, when the lawyer reached the part about the inheritance, everything seemed to settle into place. "It's clear," the lawyer said, glancing at the paper before him. "Everything, as you all are aware, has been left to Dan." The words landed like stones. I could feel the room go still around me, a strange silence that swallowed everything. My father had never been one to speak in grand gestures, but I had expected something, anything, that would recognize the years I had spent working beside him, the work I had put into our life. But no, instead there was nothing but the cold finality of those words. Everything to Dan. The lawyer went on, explaining the terms, the assets, the estate. He said that my father had considered all of us, but ultimately he had left me nothing. There was a note tucked into the will explaining his reasoning. I remember reading it over in my head. It wasn't long, but it was simple and clear. "You are already on your feet," the note said. Those words were meant to reassure me, I suppose. "You don't need anything," my father was saying. Even though I had spent my whole life building his life, working tirelessly without complaint. "You're strong, you can handle it." It wasn't a message of comfort. It felt like a dismissal, a finalization of a quiet understanding that had never been discussed openly. I didn't feel angry. Not in that moment, not yet. Anger was something that required a reaction, an outburst, something I wasn't accustomed to. Instead, I simply sat there, absorbing the words with the same quiet resolve I had always carried with me. It wasn't my first time facing something I didn't expect, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. I said nothing. I didn't argue or ask questions. There was no need. The decision had been made, and I wasn't going to challenge it in front of the lawyer or the rest of the family. I wasn't going to make a scene. Instead, I stood up, shook the lawyer's hand, and then I turned to Dan. He looked up at me, his face flushed with the weight of it all, unsure of what to say, or even how to approach the situation. I didn't want to make him feel bad. He was my brother. He had his own way of living, and it wasn't mine to change. "Thank you," I said, shaking his hand. I don't know why I said that. Maybe it was just the words that had come to me. Words that didn't really mean anything but still carried some sort of finality. It was as if I was marking the end of something, an understanding between us that had been in place for years, something that had never needed to be spoken aloud. I didn't look back as I left the lawyer's office. There was nothing left for me there. Everything had already been decided, and there was no changing it now. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. I didn't reach out to Dan. I didn't feel the need to. He had his inheritance, his house, his land, his car. I had nothing. But that was fine. I had always worked on my own. I didn't need anyone else to give me what I'd earned. I knew about the house, the land. It wasn't just a physical space. It was the legacy of my father, the culmination of all the years of his life, and the years of mine that had gone into it. But it didn't matter. It belonged to Dan now, and that was how it was going to be. Still, I couldn't help but listen. I didn't call. I didn't go over there. But I listened. I would sit in the quiet of my home, the place where I had lived for most of my life, and I'd hear about the changes, about how Dan was struggling with the upkeep of the property, about how the house, the one I had helped build, was starting to show signs of wear. There were rumors, whispers, about debts accumulating. It wasn't the first time I'd heard such things. Dan had never been the practical one. He had always relied on others to clean up his messes, to smooth over the rough patches. I had always known he wasn't cut out for the responsibility my father had placed on him. And then about 2 years after the will had been read, I got the call. It was late in the afternoon, the sky still hazy with the remnants of the sun as it dipped low. The phone rang, breaking the silence of my small house. I picked it up, not recognizing the number, but I knew who it was before he even spoke. "Ray," Dan's voice came through the line, strained and uncertain. I need your help." I let the silence stretch between us. I didn't rush to answer. I had nothing to say. He had never asked for help before. Not like this. He had never needed to. "I'm in trouble," he said. "I've got debts piling up. The house is secured, but the land, I'm selling it. I need some cash, Ray. I don't know who else to turn to." I could hear the desperation in his voice now, the panic, the quiet realization that things had gotten far beyond his control. He had taken the inheritance, but it was slipping through his fingers, and now he needed something from me. But I didn't say anything right away. I just listened. I thought about it for a moment. The house, the land, the years that had passed. I didn't owe him anything. I didn't owe anyone anything. But the world had a strange way of coming full circle, didn't it? The silence had always been the strongest tool I had. "I'll help," I said finally, breaking the silence. "But not how you think." He didn't ask what I meant. He just breathed a sigh of relief. He had been hoping I would, but he didn't understand what was coming. I didn't owe him mercy. I didn't owe him anything. But there were things, small things, that were mine, and it was time to take them back. It didn't take long for things to unravel. A few months after that phone call, I could hear the full extent of Dan's financial trouble. The land was gone, the house nearly in jeopardy. The debts were insurmountable, and he had no way to pay them off. It wasn't hard to see coming. Dan had never been careful with money. He had always lived like the world owed him something, like he could just waltz through life without consequences. And now consequences were knocking at his door. They had been for a while. Every conversation I had with him after that first phone call revealed a little more of the mess he'd gotten himself into. At first, there was the usual plea, the self-pitying tone that seemed to be his default setting whenever things didn't go his way. "I didn't ask for this," he would say, as if someone had forced him into this situation. But it wasn't anyone else's fault. It was his. All of it. At first, I stayed silent, listening to him spin his excuses, his stories of how it had all spiraled out of control. He had taken out loans to fund his business ventures that never materialized. He had relied on the house as collateral, thinking it would all work out in the end. But it hadn't. It never did for him. He called me almost every week, asking for advice, asking for money, but I didn't respond. I knew better than to get involved. His problems were his own to solve. I had my own life to focus on. But then I started hearing rumors. The house was no longer safe. The debts were mounting, and there was a buzz around town about the sale of the land that my father had worked for, the land I had helped him build this life on. It was slipping away piece by piece out of my brother's hands. I didn't want to get involved, but I knew I had to. There was a certain cold finality to it, this moment when I realized that if I didn't act, everything my father had built, everything I had helped to build, would be lost. Dan had squandered it all. The house, the land, the future. It was all on the verge of slipping into the hands of creditors, and I wasn't about to let that happen. It was time for me to step in, not with pity, not with anger, but with the quiet precision I had always relied on. The idea formed slowly. I'd take it all back, legally, properly, without fanfare. I wouldn't ask for anything. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't offer him a hand. He had taken the inheritance. Now it was mine. And so I went to the bank. I had a plan. I wasn't going to rush it. I didn't need to. It wasn't about immediate results or flashy actions. It was about the long game. I would do this the right way, and the right way was legal. All I needed was the right resources, the right paperwork. The house wasn't just a house. It was a part of me. It had been built by my father and me. I had laid that foundation. My hands had shaped those walls, nailed those beams into place. I had worked alongside my father, sweating beside him day after day. That house wasn't just property. It was history, my father's. And now it was slipping away, like everything else. It was hard to watch my brother, a man who had everything handed to him, fail to appreciate it. He had never worked for it. He hadn't earned it the way I had, and I had no intention of watching him destroy everything we had worked for. I walked into the bank with quiet resolve, a feeling of purpose guiding every step. There were people there who had no idea who I was, but I wasn't concerned with that. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone's recognition. I met with the bank representative, a man who looked at me with a certain distance. I don't know if he could tell that I wasn't just here for any simple transaction, but he didn't ask. He didn't need to. I bought the house. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need to. There was no fanfare, no grand statement. It was just business. The house was now mine legally. The bank took my check without question. The deal was sealed, and then came the land. The land that Dan had tried to sell, the land that was slipping through his fingers. I didn't want to deal with it directly. I didn't need to. Instead, I had it transferred into my name, quietly, without drama. No one saw it coming. It was my land now, my house, my inheritance. When I made the call to Dan, I wasn't sure how he would react. He didn't know I had bought everything. He didn't know that I had taken the necessary steps to make sure it all came back to me. "We need to talk," I said simply, once I had his attention. "I want to discuss the lease." I couldn't hear the reaction on the other end of the line, but I knew he was stunned. He hadn't expected this, and I wasn't about to explain it to him. Not yet, not in the way he wanted. What I had taken back was mine, not because I wanted it, but because it was what I deserved. I had worked for it. My father had built it, and I had helped him. I wasn't going to let it be lost to his careless handling. Not now. Not ever. He didn't respond right away. I could feel his confusion, his fear. He didn't know what was coming, and I didn't care to explain. I had already made my move. The house, the land, everything was back in my hands. And now it was time for him to learn what it meant to lose it all. In my silence, I would find my victory, and in his silence, he would understand his failure. I wasn't in a hurry. There was no rush, no need to overwhelm him with more than he could process. I didn't need the satisfaction of hearing him beg or watch his reaction in real time. This wasn't about that. It was about control, precision, and the slow burn of knowing the truth would settle in when the time was right. A few days after I made the call, Dan arrived. He didn't show up in the way I expected. No drama, no theatrics. He came alone, dressed in his usual ill-fitting clothes, the same worn jacket he'd been wearing for years. His eyes, once confident, were now clouded with uncertainty. The weight of everything he'd lost pressed on him, but he hadn't yet fully grasped that what he'd lost wasn't just the land or the house. It was everything that had ever been built around him. I met him at the house, standing at the doorstep like I always did. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around, as if he wasn't sure whether he was welcome. But this time, he wasn't walking into a house that he owned. This time, he was a visitor, a tenant, whether he liked it or not. I didn't offer him a seat right away. Instead, I led him into the living room, my gaze lingering on the familiar, yet now strange, surroundings. The walls, the furniture, everything seemed a little different now. It had been a long time since I had spent time here, even though it had always felt like home. The house still smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the scent of the place I had built with my father. Dan stood there uneasy, waiting for me to speak. He shifted from foot to foot, glancing at me with an air of cautious expectation. I didn't waste any time. I placed the contract in front of him, the legal document that would officially bind him to the arrangement I had created. It was a simple lease agreement, one with very clear terms. 6 months of rent, with the possibility of early eviction, no loopholes, no room for negotiation. The rules were set. It was either this or he would lose everything. He looked at the contract. Confusion and frustration etched across his face. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice strained, but not quite angry. He was still in disbelief. This was all too much for him to process. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at him, calm, steady. The silence stretched between us. Then finally I spoke, my voice low but clear. "You're strong, Dan. You can handle it." The words were an echo of what my father had said to me in that letter, a reminder of the cruel reality he had set out for me. But now it was my turn to pass those words on to Dan. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't punishing him for the sake of it. No, this was a lesson that he would either learn or he would lose everything for good. Dan remained silent for a long moment, as if weighing his options. I knew he didn't have any real choices left. He had to sign the lease. He had to stay in the house for now. And that's when it dawned on me. He wasn't just fighting for his house. He was fighting to preserve some shred of dignity, even if it meant submitting to the terms I had laid out. I had offered him a way to survive, even if it was on my terms. But it was still a lifeline. And deep down, he knew that. I could see him hesitate for just a moment longer, but eventually he reached for the pen, signing the contract with a heavy sigh. I didn't feel any satisfaction in watching him do it. No, I was beyond that. This wasn't about getting even or making him suffer. It was simply the natural consequence of his own choices. "Thank you," I said quietly, but with a finality that left no room for further discussion. It was done. Dan stood there for a moment longer, still processing what had just happened. But there was nothing more to say. No more words would change the outcome. This wasn't about negotiation. This was about reality. He looked at me one last time before he turned to leave. I didn't stop him. He didn't ask for anything more. He simply walked out of the room, left the contract on the table, and went back to the life I had given him, the life that had now been reduced to mere survival. And I stayed in the house. I stayed in the home that had been built with my hands and my father's sweat. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I simply existed in the stillness of the moment. In that silence, I found my victory. In that silence, I could hear the truth of the situation. I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine, not through force, not through violence, but through precision and patience. The deal was done, and now I would wait. The days drifted by with a steady, almost rhythmic calm. Dan stayed in the house, continuing his life in a way that was oddly familiar, yet now uncomfortable for both of us. I did not check on him every day. I didn't need to. The house was mine, legally, and that was enough. There was no need for any more interaction than what was necessary. He continued to send the rent every month, just as the contract stated. I didn't acknowledge the payments, nor did I respond to his occasional, somewhat desperate phone calls, where he would plead for some kind of extension or leniency. His tone, strained and full of guilt, seemed to weigh on me from afar, but I wasn't interested in engaging in that emotional game. His life at this point was no longer about making choices based on kindness or family. It was about survival. The first Saturday after the contract was signed, I went to the house, not to check up on him, but to simply be there. I wanted him to feel my presence without me having to say a word, to let him know that this wasn't just about money or land. It was about respect, respect for the work I had done, the life I had built. And in the quietest way possible, I wanted him to understand that his entitlement to all of this had been a lie. I hadn't been superfluous in my father's eyes, as he and others had suggested. No, I had simply been absent from the story until now, but the ending was far from written. Dan barely acknowledged me when I entered the house. I had expected that. He wasn't comfortable in his own space anymore, and that in itself was a form of control. I didn't need to dominate him in conversation. The house had already done that. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I entered, scribbling something on a piece of paper. His posture was slouched, as though the weight of his circumstances had worn him down further than he wanted to admit. The sight of him there, in this space that used to feel like mine as much as it was his, was almost surreal. He had no right to this comfort anymore. I didn't sit across from him. I didn't make any gestures to close the distance. Instead, I stood at the doorway, silently watching him for a moment. allowing him to feel the gravity of the situation without any words. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice steady, unemotional. I want to remind you of something. Dan didn't look up immediately. He shifted in his seat, sighing deeply before glancing at me, as if waiting for me to continue. You're still living here on my terms, I said, each word deliberate, quiet. I've given you 6 months, and in that time, you're expected to pay rent. Nothing more, nothing less. This isn't a charity. This isn't a favor. His eyes flickered with something. Guilt, anger, maybe even shame, but he quickly masked it with an almost imperceptible nod. I don't want to hear about your debts, I continued, my gaze never leaving him. I don't want to hear about your struggles or how hard this is for you. This is your reality now, and you're going to live in it, just like I have for all these years. Dan opened his mouth to say something, but I held up my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I've been patient, but that patience doesn't mean you get to make excuses. You're here because you couldn't manage your own life, not because I owe you anything. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't anger this time. It wasn't the usual defensiveness. There was something else, something resembling understanding, though it was fleeting. I wasn't there to humiliate him. I wasn't there to exact vengeance. I was there to remind him that I was in control of this situation. I was the one who held the keys to everything that had been stolen from me. I'm not asking for anything, I said, my voice softer but no less firm. But you need to understand that this place, this life, doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. And I expect you to treat it with the same respect you would give any other tenant. Dan didn't respond, but I didn't expect him to. I didn't need him to acknowledge me, not anymore. I didn't need his apology. It was enough that he understood where the power had shifted, even if he wouldn't admit it. With a final glance at him, I turned to leave. I didn't look back. There was no need. The silence between us spoke volumes. The house was no longer a place of warmth or memories. It was simply a structure, a transaction, a deal that had been done. I was secure in my decisions. I didn't have to force anything. All I had to do was remain steady, stay patient, and let time do the rest. And so I left him there, sitting in the same place he had been before, but now it was different. His time in the house was no longer about privilege. It was about staying silent and paying his dues. The foundation had been laid. Now it was just a matter of watching it all come to fruition. Time, I had learned, was often the most powerful force. The clock ticked in the background of my life as it had for so many years. Steady, inevitable, and unbothered by the turmoil that had engulfed my brother. Every week I drove to the house. Every Saturday without fail. I never stayed long. I didn't need to. The point wasn't to check on him or to make sure the rent was paid. That was secondary. What mattered was that I was there, and he knew it. My presence, in its quiet form, became an ever-present reminder of the reality he had failed to acknowledge for so long. Dan didn't speak to me when I came by. He didn't need to. His silence had settled into a rhythm of its own. The tension between us no longer about words or arguments, but something deeper, a chasm that had always existed, but now was impossible to ignore. The house had ceased to be a home for him. It had become a cage, a place where the past and the present collided, but neither felt truly his anymore. I didn't visit out of a sense of cruelty. I didn't care about retribution or getting back at him. That wasn't the point. The point was control. The point was that this house, this land, this legacy that had once belonged to our family was mine. I had earned it, not in a way that was easy or immediate, but through the slow and steady understanding of my own strength. And I wasn't in a rush to let go of it. Each Saturday, I entered the house the same way, without fanfare, without expectation. I'd simply walk through the door, glance around at the rooms, the walls that had witnessed everything in our family's history. The house looked the same as always, and yet nothing was the same. The energy had shifted. It no longer felt like the place we had built together. It felt empty, in a way that had little to do with the physical absence of people, but everything to do with the emotional vacancy that had settled over it. Dan had, for all intents and purposes, become a ghost in his own home. He spent his time in a kind of numb, resigned state. I could tell. He'd send the rent check every month without fail, though I never acknowledged it. He never asked for any kind of leniency. He simply followed the rules. That was the extent of his involvement in the house now. Sometimes I would catch him in passing as I walked through the house, but our interactions remained cold, almost mechanical. His eyes would avoid mine, looking everywhere but at me, and I allowed it. I didn't need anything more from him. No apology, no pleading. There was nothing left for me to say. The house had already become the only language we both needed. One Saturday, as I walked through the living room, I paused at the window, looking out at the land my father had worked so hard for. The land that had always been part of this place, a part of me. I could feel the years of effort, of labor, of sweat that had gone into building everything from the ground up. My father's hands had left their mark everywhere, from the foundation to the roof. It wasn't just the land or the house. It was everything he had built with his own two hands. Dan hadn't known the full weight of what it meant to inherit it all, to be the one who carried the legacy. I hadn't either, until I stood there, staring out at the land, understanding it for what it was. Not a possession to fight over, not something to be handed off lightly. This was something earned, something that came with responsibility. I wasn't there to enforce guilt. I wasn't there to drag him down further. I was there because I had to be. I had to maintain control. I had to show him, without saying a word, that he would never fully understand what it meant to own this place, to walk through these rooms, to live in the same space where my father had lived, without understanding the work behind it. By not saying anything, by not confronting him directly, I was speaking volumes. The silence between us was its own kind of punishment, not harsh, not aggressive, but deeply effective in a way he could never have anticipated. There were times I thought he might crack, might finally say something to me, to plead, to ask for forgiveness, or for a chance to regain some part of what he had lost. But he never did. He stayed quiet, withdrawn, as if he had learned deep down that there was no way back from the choices he had made. No way back to the past, no way back to the home he had taken for granted. And for me, that was enough. I left the house each Saturday, feeling no need to dwell on the details. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I simply felt the quiet sense of control, the realization that I had done what needed to be done. In those silent moments, as I drove away, I understood the most important thing. I didn't need anything from him anymore. All that mattered was what I had earned, and what I had regained. That was the power of silence, and it was working exactly as I had hoped. A year passed. It wasn't a year filled with grand, sweeping moments or dramatic confrontations. It was simply a year, long, quiet, inevitable. Dan continued to live in the house. He paid the rent, just as he had agreed. He maintained his distance, both physically and emotionally. The space between us, already wide from the moment the will had been read, only continued to grow. I saw him less and less, and when I did, there was always that same quiet tension, that same unspoken understanding of the roles we had been forced to play. The house was mine, as it always had been, but now it was mine in a way that was undeniably real. It wasn't just the land, the house, or the money. It was the recognition of my place in the story. The space I had once left behind was now my inheritance, not just from my father, but from a life that had taught me the value of patience, endurance, and quiet strength. And then, one Saturday, it happened. I drove to the house as I had done every week, but this time when I arrived, the car was gone. The driveway was empty, the windows dark. For a moment I stood in front of the house, looking at the silent structure, as if waiting for something to happen. The silence, however, remained unbroken. I walked through the front door, the keys still in my hand. My keys, the ones I had used to open this house for as long as I could remember. There was a sense of finality in the way the door closed behind me, as if the act of walking in had somehow sealed everything into place. This was no longer the home of my brother. This was my home. I had returned not as a guest, but as the rightful owner of everything that had been built here, everything that had once been denied to me. The house was empty, but it felt different now. It was no longer just a place where memories lingered. It was a place where I could start anew. It was a place where I could finally take my place without having to ask for permission, without having to explain myself. Everything my father had built, everything that had been taken from me, was finally mine. I walked through the rooms just as I had done so many times before. But this time, there was no brother sitting at the kitchen table. There was no awkwardness hanging in the air. There was only the weight of the years that had passed and the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The house wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of endurance, of a life lived on my terms. I moved into the master bedroom, the same room my father had slept in. I stood by the window, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to maintain. The land that had, for so long, felt like someone else's. And yet, here it was, mine now fully and completely. It was strange in a way to be standing there alone, but it wasn't an empty feeling. It wasn't loneliness. It was more a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had not fought for this home with anger or rage. I had not sought revenge. What I had done was simple. I had stayed steady. I had held my ground. And in the end, I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine. There was no confrontation, no final showdown with Dan. He had left quietly without a word. He had taken what little he had left and moved on. And I let him go, just as I had let go of all the emotions that might have once urged me to seek out vengeance, to demand retribution. As I stood there in the room, the silence settled around me. It was the silence of ownership, not just of the house, but of everything that had led me here. The years of hard work, of sacrifice, of feeling like the second choice, the one left behind. They had all led to this moment, and now I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't need to justify what I had done. It was done. I took a breath, a long, steadying inhale, and let it out slowly. There was no triumph in my chest. There was no need for it. I had what was mine. And that was enough. More than enough. The house would remain silent, just as it had always been. The past would remain where it belonged, in the rooms and the corners of the house, in the shadows of memories that would never fade. But I would be here now. I would live here. Not as a reminder of what was taken from me, but as a testament to what I had earned. And in that silence, in that quiet victory, I finally found peace. I was home.